There are parts of the past that never make it into history books. They drift quietly between the lines, not battles, not kings, not saints, but the soft, smoke-scented wisdom of ordinary people who simply tried to live another day. The Middle Ages, for all its grandeur and cruelty, was also an age of survival, of small fires against great winters, of muddy hands, aching backs, and clever minds that understood the rhythm of the land far better than most of us ever will. Imagine, if you will, a village in the fading light of a medieval dusk. The roofs sag a little under the weight of old thatch. The air smells faintly of peat smoke and wet wool. Somewhere, a woman is grinding grain in a stone bowl, her arms steady and practiced. A child sits beside her, watching sparks fall from a hearth that burns just enough to keep the chill away. The world around them is not yet measured in clocks or calendars, only in the rise of mist, the flight of crows, the hunger before spring. People survived not because life was easy, but because they remembered. They remembered how to read clouds, how to coax fire from damp wood, how to listen for the distant bark of wolves in the trees. Every gesture, the tying of a rope, the storing of roots, the choice of a certain herb, was knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next, spoken not in words, but in motion. The monasteries wrote down what they could, of course, but most of it was never written at all. The poorest farmers, the shepherds, the woodcutters, their wisdom lived in calloused hands and half-forgotten songs. Theirs was not survival as an art, but as a prayer, soft, rhythmic, unending. And so, the medieval world was stitched together not only by faith or fear, but by craft, small, almost invisible crafts that made the difference between life and death. To find water where there was none. To turn bark into bread. To make warmth from stones. To heal a wound when there was no physician for miles, only the smell of crushed sage and the murmured faith that nature itself provided what one needed. In the deep forests, where light fell in green fragments, hermits and wanderers lived by such arts. They understood how moss grew on the north side of trees, how to follow the call of birds to find rivers, how to build shelter against the sharp-toothed wind. Theirs was not a life of luxury, but of attentiveness, to the seasons, to the silence, to the slow heartbeat of the earth. But time, as it always does, began to erode those memories. The tools became relics. The recipes turned into curiosities. The whispered knowledge of old women became superstition, and then, nothing at all. The fire-making stones lay forgotten in riverbeds. The herbal pouches crumbled into dust. And yet, if you listen closely, the wind over the hills still carries faint traces of it, the lost survival methods of the Middle Ages. They were not written by scholars or priests, but by people who understood the world in its rawest form. They survived floods, famine, and plague, often with nothing more than patience and a few good secrets passed down through memory. And perhaps, hidden somewhere in their quiet endurance, there's something we modern souls have lost. As the sun fades from that medieval village and night gathers over the crooked rooftops, you can almost hear the whisper of the past, the hiss of flint against steel, the hum of a prayer half-remembered, the sigh of survival itself. And it is there, in that dim light, that our story begins. For when the world was damp and the rain fell for weeks, when wood would not burn and hands were too numb to strike a spark, that was when the art of fire was born. The rain had been falling for 3 days. Not the kind that came in brief tempests and left the air smelling fresh, but the endless kind, soft, steady, and cruelly patient. It slicked the thatched roofs until they sagged, turned paths into ribbons of brown soup, and left the world smelling faintly of damp wool and smoke that refused to rise. To live through such rain in the Middle Ages was not merely an inconvenience, it was a question of survival. For without fire, there was no warmth, no food, no light. And without those, there was no life. A man, let's call him Toma, though his name is long forgotten, crouched beneath the lip of an old stone wall. His tunic clung to him like second skin, soaked through from his morning's labor. In his hands he held the ancient tools of a secret art, a dull piece of iron, a shard of flint, and a lump of fungus the color of old parchment. Toma's father had taught him this craft when he was a boy, back when winters were harder and the family hut barely kept the snow out. The lesson was simple, but sacred. Fire doesn't come from strength, his father had said. It comes from patience. And so, crouching in the drizzle, Toma began his ritual. He took the fungus, amadou, the kind found clinging to dead birch trees, and peeled it into thin, fibrous curls. It had been dried near the hearth weeks before the rain began, carefully wrapped in a piece of linen. Even soaked, it held within it a secret hunger for flame. He struck the flint against the iron, once, twice. Sparks danced and vanished into the mist. Again, strike, breathe, strike, until one bright ember caught and lingered. He bent close, cupping it in his hands as if it were a living thing. The ember nestled in the fungus, pulsing faintly, a red heart beneath his breath. He fed it with shavings of dried bark and twisted straw, coaxing it like a whisper. And slowly, impossibly, the ember became a thread of smoke. The smoke thickened. The bark hissed. And at last the smallest tongue of flame licked upward, trembling against the damp air. A medieval fire was a triumph. Not a convenience, not a flick of a switch, but victory over the elements themselves. Every spark was a negotiation between life and weather, between knowledge and luck. Most villages kept a single, eternal flame, a hearth that never went out, guarded by the eldest woman or a blacksmith's apprentice. From that single fire, every home could rekindle its warmth. To let it die was more than clumsiness, it was nearly sacrilege. When storms swept through and drowned the world in mud, the villagers would send runners to that house. They came with clay pots or wrapped embers, carrying fire across the rain-soaked lanes like pilgrims bearing relics. And yet those who knew how to summon flame from nothing, like Toma, like his father before him, were quietly revered. It was a kind of magic that had nothing to do with sorcery, and everything to do with memory. They knew the trick of finding birch tinder under the bark where it stayed dry, the secret of keeping embers alive inside hollow horns filled with moss. They knew how to make charcloth from old linen, cloth burned into blackened softness that caught sparks like the breath of a god. To the untrained eye, these things were mere materials. To a medieval survivor, they were tools of resurrection. As the fire grew, Toma placed stones around it, trapping the heat. He lifted his hands to the glow, feeling the stiffness ease from his knuckles. Soon others would come, the neighbors, the shepherd boy, perhaps a widow with a basket of damp twigs. Fire was never private in the Middle Ages. It was shared warmth, shared hope. Around it, the village gathered, steaming, laughing softly, drying out their cloaks. Smoke curled into the night, carrying with it the faint smell of victory. The rain still fell, but now it seemed gentler, almost forgiving. For as long as that small flame lived, so would they. And in that fragile circle of light, another lesson burned quietly, that survival, in its truest form, begins with hands that remember what the world has forgotten. The fire would burn through the night. And when dawn came, pale and damp and uncertain, the villagers would step out again, carrying a piece of that warmth within them. But the flame alone could not sustain them. They needed food, not the kind that grew in fields, for the fields were often drowned or barren, but the kind that grew wild and silent in the green shadows of the forest. When the rain finally stopped, the forest began to breathe again. Mist rose from the mossy ground like the exhalation of something ancient, and drops of water trembled on the tips of ferns. For the villagers, this was the hour of foraging, the soft, damp silence before the world awoke. It was when the herbs could be found in their truest form, fragrant, glistening, alive. In those medieval woods, survival had a green scent. It was the scent of crushed nettle and wild thyme, of damp roots pulled from the soil, of the sharp tang of yarrow and sage. The people of the Middle Ages knew the forest not as mystery, but as memory, a living, breathing library of cures, food, and quiet salvation. Every village had its herb woman, sometimes called a healer, sometimes a witch, depending on who was asking. Her name might be whispered with respect or suspicion, but when a child's fever rose, or when the bread ran out and winter pressed too hard, her door was the one they knocked upon. She would appear in the morning mist, shawl pulled tight, carrying a basket woven from willow. She knew where to find the tender shoots of sorrel in spring, the bitter dandelion roots that could cleanse the blood, the foxglove that could still a racing heart, though too much could still it forever. To her, every leaf was a language. The downy feel of comfort meant healing bones. The silver-green underside of sage meant warmth and breath. The purple hue of self-heal whispered of strength against sickness. She had no formal schooling, no books. Her wisdom came from observation, repetition, and faith, not blind faith in saints or relics, but in the soft, steady patterns of the earth. In monasteries, monks kept herbals, great illuminated manuscripts filled with drawings of plants, their roots curling into the margins like tiny veins. But in the villages, the true herbal was passed down through hands and mouths. Mothers taught daughters how to dry mint above the hearth to soothe stomachs, how to steep elderflower for coughs, how to rub bruised leaves of plantain into bee stings. To survive the Middle Ages was to listen, to the land, to the seasons, to the whispers of those who came before. Even when the Church grew wary of folk medicine, branding some herbs as pagan relics, the healers persisted. Quietly, secretly. They planted their gardens behind the walls of abbeys and in the shadows of cottages. They called the plants by saintly names to appease the priests: St. John's wort instead of devil's scurf, Our Lady's thistle instead of witch's milk. Yet beneath those Christian names, the old meanings lived on. The forest was both church and apothecary, a sacred place where each rustle of leaf carried memory. And if one listened closely, the land itself offered instructions: which plants grew after storms, which roots thrived in shade, which mushrooms were kind and which could kill without bitterness. It was not a science, but a rhythm. When famine came, people turned to this knowledge to stretch what little they had. They boiled nettles into soup, roasted acorns to make bitter flour, chewed bark when bread was gone. Every herb, every root, was a thread in the great tapestry of endurance. And so, as dawn crept through the dripping leaves, the healer returned to her cottage with her basket of green life. Inside, smoke rose from a hearth that burned with yesterday's coals. She laid the herbs out upon her table, some for tea, some for salve, some to hang above the doorway to ward off spirits, or sickness, or both. Her hands moved slowly, reverently. She crushed, steeped, bound, whispered. In that small cottage, with its flickering fire and shelves of drying leaves, one could see how survival was not simply about enduring hunger or cold. It was about remembering. Remembering the shape of a leaf, the timing of a bloom, the sound of the earth's quiet heartbeat beneath the rain. Outside, the forest exhaled again. A thin ray of light touched the basket of herbs. And in that golden stillness, it seemed the world, for just a moment, was not cruel at all, but kind. Yet even as the forest healed, danger came not only from hunger or sickness, but from man and the world itself. Because survival in the Middle Ages also meant protection, not just from the weather, but from war, theft, and wandering eyes. When the storms came, they came not only from the sky. The Middle Ages were an age of uncertainty, of seasons that shifted without warning, of lords who taxed until the grain bins emptied, of soldiers who arrived like thunder on the road. A person who wished to survive learned that safety was not a gift, but something one built, board by board, stone by stone, prayer by prayer. Shelter in those days was not the solid permanence we imagine. It was a living thing, fragile, reparable, always listening to the wind. The humblest cottage could groan like an old tree during the long winter nights, and yet, within its wooden ribs, life endured. Picture a village in the hills, surrounded by oak and bramble. The huts are low and uneven, their thatched roofs thick with moss. Smoke curls from holes in the eaves, not chimneys, because chimneys are a luxury here. The smoke seeps upward, finding its own path. Inside, the walls are woven from wattle and daub, thin branches plastered with mud and straw. It smells of clay, smoke, and the faint sweetness of livestock. For a medieval peasant, that hut was not merely shelter, it was armor against a restless world. During storms, families would gather close to the fire pit, the only light in the room. The rain would hiss through the thatch, and sometimes the wind would find a way inside, carrying the sound of the forest. But the walls, patched by hand and memory, held. Always they held. When the threat was not weather but war, the villagers knew how to vanish. They built hidden shelters in the woods, pit houses covered with ferns, or dugouts beneath the roots of fallen trees. A good hiding place was as precious as gold. When soldiers came raiding, when the bells of the church tolled in warning, families would slip away into the forest paths known only to them, carrying what food they could. Even monasteries, though built of stone, were not immune to fear. Behind their serene cloisters lay narrow passages, secret chambers carved into walls where manuscripts and relics could be hidden during raids. Some abbots had escaped tunnels that led into the hills. To modern eyes, these seem like tales of paranoia, but to medieval minds, they were simply prudence, another form of survival. And yet, not all shelter was built from wood or stone. Some forms of refuge were human. A traveler seeking warmth might find it in a monastery's guest house, a simple bed, a bowl of broth, a kind word in Latin. Hospitality, for all its ceremony, was a kind of moral armor against chaos. A warm fire for a stranger might one day mean the difference between famine and survival for oneself. Still, there was something almost sacred about the act of building one's own space, however humble. In a world governed by faith and fate, the hut was one of the few places where human hands shaped safety directly. The craft of shelter was passed quietly through generations. How to thatch a roof so it would shed rain like a bird's feathers. How to dig a drainage trench that led water away from the door. How to smear lime wash on walls to keep away rot and disease. These were not written arts, but learned through repetition, through winters survived and roofs repaired by candlelight. A father teaching his son how to knot rope to a beam. A mother showing her daughter how to patch holes with moss and mud. Each act was a whisper of resilience. When war moved on, and the fields lay flattened, they rebuilt. When wind tore the roof away, they gathered the reeds again. Every patch of clay, every smooth beam, was a small defiance against the uncertainty of the age. To live then was not to escape hardship, but to withstand it gracefully, to keep the hearth burning, even as the world outside cracked and shuddered. And when the storm had passed, and the last echo of hoofbeats faded down the valley, life would resume its rhythm. Chickens scratching the dirt. Bread baking on the hearth. Smoke rising gently through a roof that once again kept out the rain. The people of that time did not call this resilience. To them, it was simply living. But even with walls and fire, survival was a thin thread. For when the skies turned cold, and the wind began to whisper of wolves and hunger, even the safest home could become a trap. And so the villagers turned to their next battle, not with soldiers or storms, but with the slow, starving silence of winter. Winter, in the Middle Ages, was not simply a season. It was a test, A long, slow reckoning that stripped the land bare and forced every living thing to remember what hunger felt like. By November, the last harvest had been threshed, and the air turned sharp with frost. Smoke rose from thatched rooftops in narrow, wavering ribbons, the only sign of life in a sleeping countryside. The fields, once loud with harvesters, lay quiet under a crust of ice. And in that quiet, the wolves came down from the hills. To survive winter was to outlast a kind of siege. The peasants, the monks, even the lords behind their stone walls, all prepared for it as though for war. The first step was food. Cabbages were buried in straw pits, apples laid in cool cellars, salted meat hung from the rafters. Everything smelled faintly of smoke, vinegar, and brine. A family might have one salted pig to last the entire winter. When it was gone, there would be broth, and then porridge, and finally, whatever the earth still offered: bark, flour, roots, dried nettles. Bread was life itself. They called it the staff of life. And yet, in many winters, that staff grew thin. Bakers stretched their flour with ground acorns, with beans, even with powdered bark. It kept bellies full, though the taste was bitter. Those who lived near forests fared best. They knew how to trap rabbits beneath snow, how to smoke fish from frozen rivers. They knew how to read the wind and how to find shelter under spruce when the sky turned white with fury. But always, there was the sound of wolves. In medieval folklore, wolves were not merely beasts, they were omens. Their howls carried through the valleys at night, long and low, echoing like a prayer denied. To hear one too close to the cottage meant you should bank the fire, and say an extra psalm before sleep. Wolves smelled hunger, they understood desperation. Sometimes, they came not for livestock but for scraps, for the edges of human life. There are parish records that tell of children taken, of shepherds vanishing into the snow. But there are also stories, whispered ones, of men who learned from the wolves. A woodsman might watch their paths and copy them, padding through the snow on silent feet, learning to move where the frost would not betray him. The wolf was enemy and teacher both, and in the end, both creatures, man and beast, sought the same thing: warmth, and the next meal. Inside the cottages, life narrowed to the glow of the hearth. The family gathered around it, speaking softly, as though words themselves might waste the air. The fire cracked, casting orange light on faces that had grown thinner since autumn. There was a rhythm to their endurance, a monk-like patience born from centuries of repetition. Mending tools, turning the meat, watching the candle burn shorter each night. Time moved differently when the sun barely rose above the horizon. And yet, there were small miracles in those months of frost. When the snow thawed enough for hunting, neighbors would share what they found. Bread passed from one hand to another carried more warmth than the hearth itself. Some nights, the entire village gathered in one large hall, singing to drown out the howling beyond the walls. The monks in their stone cloisters wrote hymns about the purity of winter, about how suffering cleansed the soul. But for the peasants outside, it was simpler: they endured because they must. And as the winter deepened, the wolves grew bolder. They came closer to the village edge, pacing through the dark, eyes glinting like coins in the firelight. The villagers hung charms above their doors: wolf teeth, crosses, bundles of yarrow, not because they believed it would stop the beasts, but because hope, like bread, was meant to be stretched thin but never run out. Every creak of the roof sounded like fate deciding. Every morning that arrived was a quiet victory. By late February, the firewood was low, the meat was gone, and the cold had settled deep into the bones of the land. Then came the thaw, slow, uncertain, dripping from the eaves like a promise whispered in Latin. The wolves withdrew to the mountains, leaving behind only their prints, like ghostly script upon the melting snow. And in that moment, fragile, miraculous, life began again. Children stepped outside, blinking at the sunlight. The earth smelled wet and alive. Seeds were counted, prayers were whispered, and once more the villagers turned from survival to hope. But not all who lived through the winter forgot its lessons. Some carried them like secret tools, the knowledge of how to ration, how to watch the wind, how to tell time by the cracking of ice. And those who lived near the woods, those who had listened closely, began to understand something more, that nature itself held the oldest knowledge of all, and that if one paid attention, the forest would teach the next way to survive. When the world grew quiet again after winter's retreat, the forest came alive, not with voices, but with listening. It was a dangerous season, that strange interlude between hunger and harvest, when people learned that survival required more than strength. It needed cunning. In medieval Europe, the difference between hunter and poacher was often no more than a matter of who owned the land. The woods, dense and whispering, belonged in theory to lords and kings. But in truth, they belonged to whoever had the patience to wait, the nerve to move without sound, and the wit to snare a meal without being seen. A man with no title could not carry a sword, but he could carry a bow, if it was short enough to hide beneath his cloak. He could carry a sling, a snare, or a sharpened stick hardened in the fire. These were the silent weapons of the forgotten poor, weapons that hunted quietly, that did not boast, that left no echo on the wind. In the deep woods there were no sermons, only instinct. You learned to tell how far a hare was by the crack of a twig, how to move with the wind so that your scent flowed away, how to cover your tracks with pine needles. You learned to listen, truly listen, to the rustle of leaves that betrayed a pheasant's wing, or the faint shift of air before a bird took flight. The forest was both teacher and judge. The best hunters made traps not from iron, but from patience. A snare of woven horsehair, a deadfall of stone balanced on a twig, crude perhaps, but deadly precise. And there was artistry in it, the placement of the bait, the reading of prints, the invisible geometry of survival. Old chronicles barely mention these men. History remembers the kings with their falcons, the nobles with their hunting horns. But it forgets the night hunters, the men and women who moved barefoot through the underbrush, catching food not for sport, but for supper. Some learned their craft from monks who tended forest hermitages. A few monks, sworn to silence, made traps for rabbits or birds as offerings for their brethren. They justified it as necessity, though in truth, there was a strange reverence in it, as if to hunt was to pray to the earth in its rawest form. In villages, too, the art of the trap was passed quietly from one generation to the next. A father teaching his son how to bend willow branches into a loop. A grandmother whispering which herbs masked human scent. These were the invisible lessons, older than books, sharper than steel. And then there were the other traps, the ones made for men. In times of war or banditry, villages protected themselves with cunning rather than armies. Pits were dug near roads, covered with branches and soil. False paths led to dead ends where the ground was soft and treacherous. A well-placed trip line could send a raider tumbling. A hidden ditch could delay a cavalry long enough for the bells to toll alarm. Such defenses were never celebrated. They were acts of quiet desperation, born of years of being prey. But they worked. To live in the Middle Ages was to understand that every tool had two faces. The same snare that caught a hare could one day save a child from hunger, or a village from ruin. And through it all, there was an odd beauty in the stillness, a sacredness in being unseen. The hunter crouched in the undergrowth, breath held, heart steady, eyes fixed on the small motion of life ahead. In that suspended moment, time seemed to forget itself. There was no lord or peasant, no saint or sinner, only the pulse of the earth and the human will to endure. When the trap finally sprang, there was no triumph, only relief. A life taken so that others could live. The medieval mind understood that balance, not as cruelty, but as the rhythm of creation itself. By night, the hunters would return to their cottages, their footsteps light, their prizes hidden. Sometimes they offered a portion to the local priest, who looked the other way. Sometimes they paid a silent tithe to the forest itself, leaving bread or ale where the moss grew thickest. It was said among the old folk that the forest remembered kindness, that those who hunted with respect would find luck in lean years, while those who took too much would one day lose their way beneath the trees. And perhaps it was true, because when the world darkened again, when storms or war or plague swept through the land, it was always the same kind of people who endured, the listeners, the builders, the ones who moved softly and carried the old skills. They knew that survival was not a shout, but a whisper. Not the clash of swords, but the click of a snare in the night. And when they lit their fires at dusk, their smoke rose gently into the sky, a signal, perhaps, to those far away. A reminder that life, fragile and stubborn, still clung on. Long before parchment carried words, the air itself was a messenger. In medieval Europe, communication was a fragile art, not written, not whispered, but signaled. And for people who lived scattered between forest and field, the difference between life and death could depend on who saw the first smoke on the horizon, or who heard the first toll of a distant bell. To live in that age was to understand language without letters. The sky, for instance, was a page. A thin thread of black smoke rising above the trees could mean a hearth newly lit after a storm. But 2 columns of smoke, thick and steady, meant something else, a warning, a call, a plea. Entire villages learned to read those plumes like scripture. High on hills, shepherds kept their watch not only for wolves, but for signs from neighboring valleys. In troubled times, war, plague, or fire, they'd burn damp moss to create slow, heavy smoke that drifted far across the land. The color and rhythm of the smoke told a story, gray for danger, white for safety, dark for invasion. It was an ancient code, carried forward from tribes and forgotten empires, surviving in the hands of people who had never touched ink. Bells, too, spoke their own dialect. Every village had one, hung high in a wooden frame or stone tower. Its voice was the heartbeat of the settlement. It told for weddings, for deaths, for storms, and for invasion. But the sound itself, the rhythm, the number of strikes, the pause between peals, held layers of meaning that only locals could truly understand. A single, slow toll at dawn, someone has died. A quick triple toll, repeated thrice, fire in the northern fields. A frantic, uneven clamor, raiders on the road. For a world without telegraphs or clocks, bells were time itself. They divided life into hours of labor and prayer. The Angelus at twilight was a universal heartbeat across Europe, the moment when tools were laid down, hats were removed, and even the tired oxen seemed to pause in the fields. In monasteries, bells called monks to matins before sunrise, to vespers at dusk, to vigils deep in the night. The sound traveled over miles of farmland, soft but commanding, a reminder that somewhere beyond the trees, someone was still awake, still watching, still praying. But bells were not always gentle. When war came, and it always did, eventually, they became alarms. Whole regions developed secret ringing patterns, known only to locals. In Normandy, a triple cry meant mounted men had been sighted. In parts of Italy, the bells were muffled with cloth when plague spread, to dampen panic and mark death silently. And between the towers, messages sometimes traveled in sound alone. Villages took turns ringing at intervals, carrying a warning from hill to hill faster than a horse could ride. It was, in a sense, Europe's first early warning system, born of fear, maintained by faith. Even at sea, the rhythm continued. Sailors used flags by day, torches by night, smoke by morning. A flicker on a distant deck could change the course of an entire voyage. To those who watched carefully, the horizon itself seemed to speak. Then there were the secret messengers, the monks, the couriers, the barefoot pilgrims who carried written notes hidden in candles or sewn into hymns. Their world was dangerous, their routes uncertain. To deliver a message across kingdoms might take months. A single misread trail, and the words would vanish forever. But most communication, in truth, happened quietly. A loaf of bread left on a doorstep could mean gratitude. A branch crossed on a path could mean, "Do not come." Even birds were believed to carry intent. A magpie landing twice before dawn was said to warn of betrayal. Everything spoke, if one listened. And so, the medieval peasant learned to read not only scripture, but the language of wind and metal. Smoke meant neighbor. Bells meant order. Silence meant danger. At dusk, when the day's last bell tolled, smoke would curl again from the hearths, the soft, steady kind that meant peace. In that twilight hush, the villagers would listen to the echoes fade across the hills, as if the land itself were breathing. And though they didn't know it, this quiet choreography of smoke and sound held their fragile world together. It told them they were not alone, that even when words failed, someone was still out there, keeping watch. Yet survival needed more than warning. It needed endurance, the kind forged in the simplest of acts, boiling water, baking bread, feeding fire. And so, as the bells fell silent and the night gathered its cold cloak again, the people turned back to the small rituals that had kept them alive since time began, to the ancient alchemy of water, bread, and ash. The hearth was the heart of a medieval home. It glowed, it smoked, it held the warmth of life itself. Around it, families gathered not for conversation or comfort, but for survival, for here, amid the flickering embers, were the tools of endurance: water, bread, and ash. Water was the first challenge. Streams could run clear, but contamination was invisible. A single sip of stagnant water could bring illness or death. Villagers learned to purify it through the simplest of methods: boiling, straining through cloth, or dropping a piece of charcoal into the pot to settle impurities. Monks experimented with herbs, sage, thyme, or elder, both for flavor and antiseptic qualities. These methods were imperfect, but they were the difference between life and sickness during long winters. Bread, the staff of life, demanded equal reverence. Flour was precious, often ground by hand on a stone quern. Bakers stretched it with ground beans, acorns, or barley when wheat was scarce. Water, kneaded into the dough, absorbed salt and ash. Ashes collected from previous fires, sifted fine, added a trace of mineral and leavening. This was not culinary art for pleasure, but for necessity. Every loaf was a record of skill, memory, and the will to survive. And ash, the forgotten element of endurance, was used in ways modern minds might scarcely imagine. Mixed with water, it created a rudimentary lye solution, which could cleanse dishes, wash clothes, or treat minor wounds. Sprinkled around the perimeter of huts, it could repel insects or small animals. Ash was, in a sense, a silent partner to survival, a byproduct of the hearth that returned in service to the household. Together, these three elements formed a daily ritual that shaped life in medieval Europe. Morning began with water drawn from the well, sometimes poured over grains to soak before baking. Midday meant bread broken slowly, often shared among neighbors to sustain community. And at night, when the fire crackled and ash lay cool around the hearth, families reviewed the day's small victories: the loaf that did not burn, the child who did not fall ill, the pot of water still clear. Survival, they understood, was a balance. Each element supported the others. Without clean water, bread could not nourish. Without bread, the body weakened against cold and disease. Without ash, the hearth and household fell into chaos. Even in famine, these small practices endured. People learned to forage, to soak roots, to roast bark when grain was scarce. Water was filtered through cloth or sand. Bread was baked in ovens heated by shared firewood. Ash was carefully collected from every hearth to extend life in subtle ways. In monasteries, these practices were preserved with near religious devotion. Monks kept detailed accounts of water quality, baking methods, and the uses of ash. They taught novices that each ingredient held a lesson: patience, precision, and the understanding that life was often fragile but could be nurtured if treated with care. The villagers, meanwhile, continued quietly, without records or texts. Knowledge was transmitted through action, memory, and careful observation. Children watched their mothers and fathers, learning not through lectures but through the rhythm of daily tasks. They saw how water could be transformed, how bread could sustain, how ash could serve silently. In these lessons lay a subtle, enduring magic. And yet, even these tools were not enough without vigilance. Rainstorms, wolves, raids, any could undo the careful balance of water, bread, and ash. That is why survival was never a matter of a single day. It was a lifetime of small acts, repeated with devotion, until habit and instinct merged. Through the simplest routines, the medieval mind learned resilience. Every loaf baked, every pot of water boiled, every hearth swept and replenished with fresh ash, was a victory, a quiet statement that life could continue, no matter the hardship. As night fell, and the hearth flickered low, the villagers rested. Outside, the wind whispered over the frozen fields, but inside, the household pulsed with life, a small, steady heartbeat against the encroaching dark. And for those who survived, the next lesson was waiting, hidden in the wandering paths beyond the village, the secret knowledge of traveling healers and hermits, who carried survival methods into lands where even bread, water, and ash might not be enough. In a world where survival often depended on knowledge lost or hidden, the wandering healers became silent lifelines. They moved like shadows between villages, across forests, and along rivers, carrying with them not gold or weapons, but the accumulated wisdom of generations, remedies, instructions, and secret methods of endurance. Some were monks, cloaked in rough wool, traveling to distant abbeys to deliver manuscripts or medicinal herbs. Others were mendicants, barefoot and thin, begging for food while dispensing knowledge. A few were women, known as herbalists or wise folk, who traveled under the guise of pilgrims, carrying baskets of dried herbs, roots, and ointments. Their paths were dangerous. Roads were not safe. Bandits, soldiers, and harsh weather could undo a day's careful progress in a single hour. Yet they persevered, for the information they bore was often worth more than life itself. A single remedy could heal infections, staunch bleeding, or ease the bite of frost. A lesson in trap building or fire making could keep a family alive through winter's cruelest days. In village squares, they would sometimes set up small demonstrations. Children would gather, watching the careful preparation of poultices, the boiling of roots, the extraction of oils from leaves. Adults would listen politely, absorbing the knowledge silently, understanding that a wandering healer could vanish at dawn, leaving only the memory of the instructions imparted. Secrets were passed subtly. A hand might brush against a herb, signaling which were safe to eat. A whispered chant would guide a novice in creating an antiseptic salve. Knowledge was never written plainly, for ill intent could destroy it. Instead, it was encoded in gestures, in repeated rituals, in the rhythm of teaching itself. Many healers carried forbidden manuscripts, hidden in hollow walking sticks or sewn into the hems of cloaks. These books contained instructions deemed too dangerous by the church or by local authorities, recipes for extracting life from the forest, techniques for preserving food beyond the winter, even instructions on how to survive during sieges. Traveling at night, they relied on stars and landmarks. They understood that rivers were both guides and boundaries, that forests could shelter or betray, and that human settlements were fraught with both danger and opportunity. They read the land as one reads scripture. Every stone, every bend in the path, held instruction for those willing to notice. Villagers who received these teachings were sworn to secrecy. The knowledge was sacred, and its misuse could bring ruin. A wrongly prepared herb could kill rather than cure. A poorly set trap could injure a neighbor. Thus, survival depended not just on the knowledge itself, but on careful, reverent application. Through these wandering teachers, survival became communal. One healer could touch dozens of lives in a week, leaving behind lessons that would ripple through generations. Mothers taught daughters, fathers taught sons, and slowly, the fragile thread of endurance spread like roots through the medieval landscape. Even as the world changed, with new lords, shifting borders, and the slow encroachment of towns, these healers remained constant. They were the hidden veins of medieval Europe, moving quietly beneath the surface, ensuring that the knowledge of fire, water, food, and shelter did not vanish entirely. And for those who observed carefully, the healers carried more than remedies. They carried hope. They carried the quiet reminder that, even when the land seemed merciless and survival improbable, life could continue. It was this understanding that would pass into legend, that those who learned from the wandering healers were better equipped for the trials of the wild, for the wolves, the storms, the cold winters, and the sudden violence of men. They knew that true survival relied on preparation, attentiveness, and respect for the hidden patterns of the world. And so, as the healers disappeared down the forest path, their baskets light but their knowledge heavy, they left behind not just cures and instructions, but a legacy of endurance. It was a reminder that the secrets of survival were not held in fortresses or in gold, but in patient observation, careful hands, and hearts that honored the earth. From these lessons, one truth emerged. The medieval world, though harsh, had a subtle order, and within that order, survival was always possible for those willing to learn its quiet language. The Middle Ages are often remembered for their battles, their kings, and their towering cathedrals. Yet, beneath the grand narratives, there existed a quieter story, one of survival, of careful attention, and of knowledge that has largely been forgotten. It is the story of ordinary people who lived through extraordinary hardship, using tools, wits, and patience rather than armies or wealth. We have already walked through the methods they used, coaxing fire from damp wood, reading herbs and forests for sustenance, building shelters from mud and timber, surviving harsh winters, and learning the silent language of smoke, bells, and wandering healers. These were not heroic tales in the traditional sense. There were no banners waved or songs sung. There were only small, deliberate acts, repeated, refined, and passed down through generations. Modern life has largely abandoned such methods. We have taps that provide clean water, supermarkets that offer bread year-round, central heating to chase away winter's chill. And yet, in doing so, we have lost something vital: the intimate knowledge of survival, the awareness of the world's rhythms, and the quiet resilience that comes from living in constant conversation with nature. Imagine a medieval peasant observing the stars to gauge the seasons, listening to the wind to know when wolves would approach, boiling water to ensure it was safe, or carefully balancing a snare in the underbrush. Every act was both practical and profound, a conversation between human and environment that demanded attentiveness and respect. Even the smallest lessons carry weight: the use of ash to disinfect or repel pests, the sharing of bread and warmth to preserve community, the way smoke could convey messages faster than words. These acts, seemingly mundane, ensured that families survived winters, raids, plagues, and famine. They created continuity where chaos threatened. The wandering healers, the herbalists, the watchful hunters, they embodied the essence of this quiet legacy. Their knowledge was practical, yes, but also moral, survival required care, patience, and an understanding of balance. Life was fragile, and it demanded respect. And still, traces of this world linger. In the ways traditional medicines continue to treat ailments, in the recipes that survive in local communities, in the quiet methods of foraging and observation still practiced by those who seek to live closer to nature. The wisdom of the Middle Ages, though buried beneath centuries of modern convenience, waits patiently to be remembered. In reflecting on their lives, we see that survival is less about technology and more about attentiveness, creativity, and connection, to the land, to each other, and to the rhythms of existence itself. The medieval world teaches that resilience is not always loud, it is often small, subtle, and quietly persistent. As we close this exploration, consider the hands that learn to build shelter from mud, to coax fire from wet flint, to read the forest as one reads a book. Consider the silent lessons passed from mother to child, healer to villager, hunter to apprentice. That is the quiet legacy of the Middle Ages, one of resourcefulness, patience, and endurance. And perhaps, if we listen closely to the wind, watch the patterns of smoke, and respect the hidden language of the natural world, we too can reclaim some fragment of that lost knowledge. Not to survive in the wilderness as they did, but to live more fully in the complex, hurried world we have inherited, remembering that even in silence, even in the simplest acts, there is wisdom waiting to be heard. The Middle Ages, for all their challenges, were a testament to human ingenuity and quiet strength. And though the centuries have passed, the echoes of their lessons remain, in the herbs we cultivate, the fires we kindle, the shelters we build, and the stories we tell. Survival, in its truest sense, is timeless.